Hey, welcome all to Newbridge Residents Present. Today's talk will be If I Forget Thee, O Jerusalem. And our speaker, who I've had a chance to talk to for the last 10 minutes, you'll love him, is Fred Ehrich. He's a resident in the assisted living. He will tell us about his volunteering in the Israel Defense Forces, the Haganah, after the invasion of Israel by the 5 surrounding Arab countries on the occasion, the creation of the State of Israel. On May 15, 1948, following the UN vote in November 1947, he did this when he was 19 years old and fought through until peace came. He was born in New York City and went to MIT at age 15 and graduated at age 18. After that, he'll tell us about how he life and marriage to his wife, Joan, and his family. And he worked in an impressive career at MIT and then at GE Aviation and developed gas turbine engines for airplanes. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll pick them up, as will Nancy, and there'll be a chance for Q&A afterwards. The presentation is about 40 minutes long. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And I've got one other comment I was thinking about. My friend, Michael Thorner, is not here. Let's hope he gets well and it'll be better for us for the next time. And you won't have, as Nixon once said, you won't have me to kick around anymore. And on top of that, my friend Bob Weinstein had suggested that we might want to change the format when we get back into meeting in person. He suggested it might be interesting to have a conversation with two people on the BIMA. One would be answering the resident making the presentation, and the other person would be questioning them as they went along, allowing for some conversation and question from the audience in between. With that, I will turn it over to Fred and Nancy.
We're going to present here and now a view of my own experience as a volunteer in the Haganah, as the Israeli Defense Force was called in the Israel's War of Independence, Milchama Ha'atzmaut, with slides with a blue background showing events leading up to my volunteering in the Haganah, my involvement in the hostilities, and my homecoming, followed by some biographical notes on my later years thereafter, and supplemented by slides with blank white background showing the historical events that propelled the narrative. An excerpt from the Bible, indicative of the Israeli and traditional Jewish devotion to the city of Jerusalem, which, as we shall see, became the byword in the relief of the city from the encirclement and siege by the heavily equipped army of Jordan, armed and commanded by a mercenary British officer corps, including their commander John Glubb, or as he was then known, Glubb Pasha. Here I am as an MIT graduate in June 1947, graduating at 18 years old and feeling too young for work or a graduate degree. I decided to apply for an international fellowship and see a bit of the world. The early age of graduation was not as unusual as it might seem today. At the time, educators dealt with precocious students by acceleration through the grade system, where today they would be dealt with by enrichment, staying with their peers in age. Here's my registration at the Delft Institute of Technology, the premier engineering school in the Netherlands in the lovely town of Delft, just reopened after closure in World War II, nestled within the old moated town, but in recent years expanded with modern buildings in former farm fields south of the old town. Before the beginning of classes, we suffered through initiation into the Studentenbond, so-called Groentide, green time, a week of extreme harassment, including a shaven head, but not as extreme as the German student bonds with their practice of dueling with swords to come away with facial scars. On the left is a view of Delft. All contemporary 1950s photos are black and white, so I've used a 17th century painting by Vermeer of Delft, since the town's appearance has changed little since then. Delft is also famous as the Venice of the North for its lovely canal streets. The inner city is dominated by two big churches, the Oude Kerk, or Old Church, dating from 1246, with its leaning tower and beautiful stained glass windows, and the Nieuwe Kerk, or New Church, dating from 1584, with its rich history and connection to the royal family who are buried there. Delft is also known over the world as for its exquisite Delft porcelain. Don't dare call it China, and its eminent engineering university. On the right, me exploring the Netherlands. But the outside world and discovery of the recent past and its then current aftermath intruded on the otherwise idyllic present, the Holocaust, 1939 to 1945, knowledge of which was spotty in the Allied nations, with its enormity not fully appreciated in 6 years of unimaginable German brutality and inhuman efficiency. After the Holocaust, some 250,000 tortured souls, survivors, innocent men, women, and children, and those among the 6 million who did not survive. From 1945 to 1947, after the Holocaust, there were tens of thousands of Jewish survivors in Poland, as well as refugees who had returned there from the Soviet Union, who were referred to as displaced persons, or DPs. On comprehending the enormity of the destruction of Polish Jewry and being confronted with manifestations of anti-Semitism, which reached the zenith with the Kielce pogrom of July 1946, well after the end of World War II, during which 42 Jews were killed and more than 40 were wounded. The remaining Jews decided to move westward to the American-occupied zone so that they too arrived at the DP camps in 1947. They were joined by a further wave of Jewish refugees from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and the total number of DP camp inhabitants reached a peak of 250,000 persons. Prior to the ship exodus, ships with Jewish refugees attempting to land in Palestine were intercepted by the British, and the Holocaust survivors on board were imprisoned on Cyprus. The refugee ship Exodus, carrying 4,515 Holocaust survivors, including 1,600 men, 1,282 women, and 1,672 children and teenagers, was manned by a crew of some 35 volunteers, mostly American Jews. In July 1947, it was intercepted by the British naval forces off the coast of Palestine, and the passengers were forcibly returned to detention camps in Germany. A vote of the United Nations for a two-state partition, Palestine and Israel, as a solution to the problem. On the 29th of November 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on the partition plan adopted by 33 votes to 13 with 10 abstentions. The Jewish side accepted the UN plan for the establishment of two states. The Palestinians rejected it and called upon all the neighboring Arab states to join them in annihilating the Jews.
War was to become the fate of a generation of Jews living in Palestine, the land of Israel. They, and often their parents, were people who had struggled and built for half a century, inspired by a dream of Jewish sovereignty. And they were to be joined by Jews from Arab countries. and by those who had survived the European tragedy and longed for a homeland free from persecution.
Egypt, no. Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes.
Resolution of the Dutch Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstained.
The UN plan internationalized the city of Jerusalem as an isolated city surrounded by hostile Palestinian territory. But Israel reluctantly accepted this grievous omission as a desperate solution to this 2,000-year gap in their statehood in the land of their Bible. The Arabs, overwhelmed by their aim to exterminate the nation state of Israel, called upon their 5 neighboring Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, and Egypt, to invade the Jewish state and assist them in annihilating the 600,000 Jews there. The Palestinian Arabs missed the opportunity of achieving their own statehood in a territory considerably larger than the current West Bank Gaza Strip part of a 2-state solution that the Palestinians have yet to achieve. Premier David Ben-Gurion, presiding at the Israeli independence ceremony, Yom Ha'atzmaut, note 2 women in the otherwise all-male participation, and a picture of Theodore Herzl presiding over the assembly. First day cover, Independence Day, 1948. First postage stamps of the new state. Lots of firsts after 2 millennia of yearning. Defense Army of Israel, formed from the Jewish Brigade of the British Army that participated in the liberation of Western Europe and the defeat of the Nazi regime, plus the forces of Jewish settlers in kibbutzim and towns who had defended them from Arab attacks in the early 20th century prior to World War II. When initially attacked, the Israelis had only small arms, no air force, no tanks, no heavy artillery, no navy. Several of the attackers had a plenitude of these heavy weapons. Israel, attacked by neighboring Arab states in May 1948, including seizure of East Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the 4 quarters of the Old City, Jewish, Christian, Arab, and Armenian, and of the former British police fort at Latrun, commanding the road and water pipeline pumping station from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and opening the way for the Jordanians to lay siege to the 100,000 Jews in West Jerusalem. Here's a camp near Marseille, France, for training volunteers from outside the land, Mitnaveh Hotzle Aretz, known by its acronym Machal, with the volunteers known as Machalniks. Displaced persons, including me, embarking for Israel on the Kibbutz Galiot in gathering of the exiles, not quite as long as 40 years in the Sinai desert from Egypt to the Holy Land, but just as momentous. Exodus on the Kibbutz Galiot, on the deck and sleeping quarters. My less than luxurious voyage to Israel, when the ship reached proximity to the shore at night, lighters came and transported the men of military age to the beach. I think the objective of secrecy was to keep a pace of the Arab violation of a UN temporarily mandated prohibition of expanding their military force, taking advantage of their tens of millions population compared to Israel's 600,000 population, and the necessity of drawing on volunteers from overseas to do so. Machalnik's personal weapons. Israeli troops had small arms and little else, particularly in the beginning months of the War of Independence. The German Mauser K98K in back was acquired in large numbers from Czechoslovakia. German insignia are embedded in the metal, but the sling went with the rifle was of Israeli manufacture and bore the Israeli Tzadik, standing for Tzava or army. The Mark II Sten gun in front is a 22-shot submachine gun of British design. Sten guns, one of which was my personal weapon, were made in underground factories by Palestinian Jews during the British Mandatory period. Here we view East Jerusalem and the Old City seized by Transjordan Army, armed by British and officered by British mercenaries, placing Jewish West Jerusalem under siege. Hebrew University and Hadassah Hospital were isolated on Mount Scopus as an island from the besieged city of West Jerusalem. During a United Nations brokered ceasefire, the Israelis attempted to resupply the isolated and beleaguered Hadassah Hospital and the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus with a convoy of ambulances and buses. It was ruthlessly attacked by an armed Arab contingent. There were 79 Israeli casualties and 20 non-fatal injured, mostly doctors, nurses, students, and faculty members. Here's a poster, Jerusalem under siege, conserve water. We will strangle Jerusalem, vowed the Palestinian Arabs leader in 1948, Abdul Qadir Husseini. For many weeks, the city's 100,000 Jews endured the ordeals of a siege, their meager well water ration distributed by tank trucks. Jerusalem under siege. Be wary of loose talk from mouth to ear. The Hebrew equivalent of the USA World War II vision, a slip of the lip can sink a ship. A few convoys managed to struggle past the Arab ambushes on the road from Tel Aviv, while the Haganah strove to claw a relief road referred to as the Burma Road across the Judean hills. Most Jewish trucks with crude improvised armor, like the burning vehicle above left, fell victim to the Arab ambushes. Their rusted ruins for many years thereafter stood along the highway to Jerusalem, some scrawled with messages like, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem," silent memorials to the sacrifices men and women of the Haganah made to keep the Jews of the city alive through the siege. Here I am with the Haganah, Corps of Engineers, Field Company 8, early autumn 1948. After engaging in defensive warfare on the Alexandroni front opposite Arab Tulkarm, the company arrived in Jerusalem by Burma Road shortly after it was opened. It participated in expansion of the Jerusalem enclave's perimeter by offensive nighttime demolition of Arab fortifications and pre-dawn defensive laying fields of anti-tank mines. The company presented the difficulty of communicating among three language groups with bilingual Hebrew-speaking officers who also spoke Yiddish or English in dealing with non-fluent Hebrew speakers. In the Hebrew-English squad were me, the only American, but with a large contingent of spirited South African Jewish volunteers. My comrades in arms used to tease me about bringing along my Jerusalem Post, even on military missions, to sate my addiction to my hometown newspaper, the New York Times, which of course was not readily available in wartime Israel. Friends and others along the way. Chaim Blanc. Chaim was an American Machalnik, a friend and a skilled multilinguist with a specialty in Arabic. He was grievously wounded in battle and totally blinded. He chose to settle in Israel after the war and had a distinguished career as a professor of linguistics at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He was also a prominent and ardent advocate of reconciliation with the Palestinians. We are also honored to have David Ben-Gurion as a visitor to our encampment in Jerusalem. Now for a bit of Israeli music from Shoshana Damari, the Jewish Yemenite queen of Israeli songs, in a recording from the 1950s, singing again the song she had sung as she came to entertain the troops in Jerusalem in 1948. Dodi Li, My Beloved is Mine, from the biblical love poem, The Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, set to music.
אני לא הרועה בשושנים דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים מי זאת עולה מן המדבר מי זאת עולה מקוטרת אור לבונה דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים ליבתי לי אחותי קלה ליבתי לי קלה ליבתי לי אחותי קלה ליבתי לי קלה דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים אורי צפון ובואי תימן אורי צפון ובואי תימן דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים אני לא הרועה בשושנים דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים ליבתי לי אחותי קלה ליבתי לי קלה ליבתי לי אחותי קלה ליבתי לי קלה דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים דודי לי ואני לא הרועה בשושנים
Stella and Yitzhak Weishelfish, Afula, Israel, 1950. Stella was a Dutch Jewess who survived World War II in hiding. I met her in Delft. Her fiancé, Yitzhak, was a Sabra, that is, prickly cactus pear or native Israeli. He fought with the Jewish Brigade in the British Army in World War II and met Stella when his unit participated in the liberation of the Netherlands. By rare coincidence, he was also a member of my unit in the Haganah. They were reunited after the cessation of hostilities in Israel and settled in the town of Afula. Cessation of hostilities in January 1949. In terms of life and the uprooting of human populations, the Arab rejection of the UN-mandated partition, and the Arab assault on Israel had disastrous consequences. Killed in the war from November 29, 1947 to January 1949 were 4,000 Israeli soldiers and 2,373 civilians, 1% of the Jewish population of Israel, then 600,000. No Israeli family went untouched. The invading armies lost an estimated 5,000 to 15,000 killed. Tribute on Mount Herzl to fallen Machal from the Israeli War of Independence. Note also visible tributes to foreign volunteers from Holland, Chile, and Cuba who gave their lives to sustain Israel. Among the 4,000 Israeli military deaths were 119 overseas volunteers, including 40 Americans and Canadians. Homeward bound aboard the Saint-Malo from Bordeaux to New York City, pitching and rolling in stormy weather. February 1949, making a great arc southward through the Azores to avoid the stormy weather in the North Atlantic. A Liberty freighter carrying a cargo of French wine and perfume, and 4 passengers, forcing me to learn how to play bridge during the several weeks of passage from France, just emerging from the ravages of World War II. Home again, all in one piece. In February 1949, I was welcomed home by my family with great relief and just in time to enroll in the graduate school at MIT for the spring semester, working toward my doctorate degree, a bit wiser and more mature than I would have been a year and a half earlier. Here is a look at Israel after the war. The West Bank of Palestine, including East Jerusalem, the Old City, remained occupied by the invading army of Transjordan, which changed its name to Jordan. And the Gaza Strip remained occupied by the Egyptian invaders from 1948 until 1967, a missed 19-year opportunity of forming a Palestinian state, its second opportunity after rejecting the UN's offer of a 2-state resolution. Some 720,000 Arabs fled Israel, urged on by the invading armies to clear the field for their anticipated slaughter of the Israelis. They found no welcome in the vast reaches of the surrounding Arab states, although 160,000 other Arabs stayed in the Jewish state and became Israeli citizens. Most of the 870,000 Jews, so-called Mizrahi or Eastern, who were citizens of Iran and the Arab nations neighboring Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, and Egypt, and North Africa, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco for many centuries before the War of Independence. Some from Babylonian biblical times sought refuge in Israel, in effect an exchange of refugees. Even with the ceasefire agreement, the Palestinians continued the hostilities in the format of terrorism. Numerous commercial aircraft hijacking attacks in the 1960s and 70s, such as the one where the hostages were successfully freed by an Israeli assault team at Entebbe Airport in Uganda in July 1976, and the assassination of the Israeli Olympic team in Munich in 1972, shown as an Israeli assault team liberating the hostage passengers at Entebbe. Ingathering of the exiles, in addition to the welcoming of and assimilation of Mizrahi Jews fleeing Iran and the Arab states, Israel fulfilled its destined role of welcoming Jews and offering a haven from persecution. The displaced person camps in Europe soon were emptied of European, so-called Ashkenazi, Eastern European, and Sephardic descendants of Jews from Spain and Portugal expelled from the Iberian Peninsula at the end of the 15th century. Jewish Holocaust survivors. Operation Magic Carpet, an operation between June 1949 and September 1950, brought 49,000 Yemenite Jews to the new state of Israel by air. Israel welcomed over 700,000 Russian Jews and Jews from the former Soviet republics, fleeing the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the accompanying resurgence of anti-Semitism in the 1980s and 1990s. In 1991, over the course of 36 hours, a total of 34 LL passenger planes with the seats removed to maximize passenger capability flew 14,325 Ethiopian so-called Beta Israel Jews nonstop to Israel. Some believe that King Solomon and Queen of Sheba brought Judaism to Africa. We conclude with a glimpse of my experiences after Israel, some references to my personal biography after I returned to the United States. Back to MIT for graduate school. I did my doctoral thesis in the technical area of fluid mechanics, but specialized in the field of solid body mechanics, that is vibration in high-speed rotors, for much of my career in industry. My first job when graduating was in the field of aircraft gas turbine engines, some of which British and German prototypes were actually flying toward the end of World War II, but which was a new and burgeoning field in 1947 when I started work, and which offered many opportunities to being involved. Marriage to Joan, over 65 years and still a loving couple in spite of the recent severe disability of Joan. I met Joan through the fortuitous unplanned meeting on a street in New York City by Joan, who by chance met a former classmate of hers from Smith College in New York City. Her friend she met worked in the same office as my sister. Thereby hangs the tale of the unlikely circumstances that resulted in my meeting Joan. I commuted weekends from my job in Philadelphia to New York City to court Joan. We were attracted to each other from our very first meeting and were engaged within 3 months and married in less than a year after our first meeting. Our marriage was embellished with glorious travel throughout Europe, North and Central America, Asia, Israel, Australia, and Morocco. It started from 2 days after we were married in September 1955. I had arranged with my then employer to take a position for 1 year as their representative at Rolls-Royce and Derby in the Midlands of England for aircraft turbine technology exchange. We were forced to take the transatlantic trip with first-class accommodations on the New Amsterdam luxury liner. The pre-jet engine aircraft could not handle 2 heavy steamer trunks, and we spent our honeymoon year in Britain with frequent trips to Europe, just a ferry ride away with our auto across the English Channel. Joan was an inveterate book person. Over the course of our marriage, she started as a volunteer in a small village's library in England, and particularly enjoyed the visits to remote farms with the library's mobile library bus. Later, back in the US, she gradually expanded her role as Temple Emmanuel's librarian as a volunteer, and eventually as a professional school librarian in the Marblehead school system. Looking toward retirement, she undertook the responsibility of a book club leader. Throughout all of our lifetime, she was an omnivorous reader. I spent my entire professional career as a research, design, and development engineer in the area of aircraft gas turbines. One of my principal accomplishments was a leader of the design and development of the GE Aviation T-64 turboshaft turboprop aircraft engine, shown here with several of the helicopters and turboprop aircraft the engine powered. I also made significant contributions to the analytic procedure used in engine design, with over 40 published technical papers to my credit. One very exciting and pioneering effort was in one of the earliest applications of the then newly available and still primitive by today's standards of digital computers in the early 1950s. I offered a contest between myself working with an early primitive digital computer against a team of about a dozen engineers and technicians working with slide rules and desktop electromechanical four-function calculators on a performance bulletin for a new engine. I beat them by several days and provided assurance that this was the wave of the future for engineering computation. I edited and co-authored the Handbook of Rotordynamics, a widely used text on vibration in high-speed rotors. Along the way, I had developed specialized skills in the field of rotordynamics, the study of vibration in high-speed rotors, such as are typical in gas turbines, as well as friends in various subspecialties of the same field. I then organized the group into writing a text book on the subject with myself as editor and a principal author of the section of the book on the subspecialty of design and development, resulting in a very successful text that was subject of 3 editions and 2 publishers. I was gratified and honored to be elected to membership in the National Academy of Engineering, which, along with the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Science, represent the highest technical associations to which American technologists can aspire. Joan and I enjoyed one of our favorite pastimes, sailing. For a man who spent his boyhood in Manhattan, living in Marblehead was like living on vacation continuously for over 60 years. I learned to sail on the Charles River Basin as an undergraduate at MIT, and we took advantage of our town's exquisite harbor and its location on the North Shore of Boston for a life embellished by sailing. First in a 15-foot sloop day sailor, the Eldina, after our 3 children, Elliot, Diane, and Naomi, for 15 years, and then with a 20-foot sloop named Blithe Spirit, with living accommodations for 2 adults, plus hypothetically 2 children, for another 15 years. Here is a view of Joan and our family celebrating my 80th birthday in New York City Central Park, where I played as a boy, with 3 lovely children, 2 girls and 1 boy, all devoted to and caring for their elderly parents, and all engaged in distinguished and gratifying careers, and with 3 equally wonderful spouses. We are blessed. Each couple has 2 children of their own. 4 of the 6 grandchildren have completed university and are now either working or in graduate school, with the other 2 still involved in their undergraduate studies. And now we have a bit of time for some conversation, including your questions and comments.
Well, Fred, before we get any other questions, I'd like to thank you for your informative presentation. It's rare that we get to see people who actually made history as opposed to telling us about it. So I am thrilled. I think everybody else is too. I have 1 question, 2 questions, really. Have you been back to Israel or had communications with the people that you were involved in during the Haganah period? And what do you think of Israel today, if you want to comment on it?
The answer to your first question, yes, Joan and I were back to Israel several times. The last time being before we got too old to do much traveling, being in 1998, celebrating the 50th year of Independence Day in Israel, with a huge celebration in a major stadium near Jerusalem. I guess it was for soccer. And I particularly remember after some musical presentations there, I said, it's really not as exciting for me as it was hearing Shoshana Damari present when I was a soldier there. And who should be on the stage next is Shoshana Damari in her 80s, and with still a beautiful voice. And I was quite thrilled that Joan had an opportunity to hear her.
Fred,
I want to say, I've looked at your pictures, And you haven't lost any of your boyish charm. You're still young and vibrant. Does anyone have any questions? Just sort of raise your hand or
Here I am.
you're on.
So, Fred, I also live in assisted living. I also graduated from MIT. I also skipped 2 grades. And I was born in Tel Aviv during the war. When I saw your presentation, I said, it's Beshert. It was a wonderful presentation as well. Where we differ is my doctorate is from Harvard, not from MIT. But my husband did get his doctorate at MIT. So we have incredibly parallel lives. In fact, that rifle that you showed, my uncle fought in the Tzava, and he came to visit us carrying that rifle. And I loved my uncle, but I was worried that he would shoot himself with that rifle. It looked so ominous to me.
Oh, thank you for sharing your background with us.
Well, it's so amazing. Your presentation was fantastic. It moved me to tears, Fred.
Oh, thank you.
Bob?
Yeah, I wonder if Fred could answer the second part of your question, Peter, about what he thinks of Israel and its government today.
My feelings are quite mixed, obviously. I'm a proponent of the binational state, and yet my experience with the Arabs is such that I'm slightly frightened of it. That there should there be a resurgence of their nationalism and anti-Semitism. So it's not I can't give a straightforward answer to that. It's very mixed.
Any other questions?
I have a question. What was the experience like of being in the Haganah? You were such a young man then.
Well, people have asked me that question. I reply that I think adolescents think they're immortal.
Right.
Doesn't fear death or doesn't even conceive of dying. But it was inspirational. I was immersed in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and that's never left me. I've always been very sensitive and acknowledging of the horror of that era. And in terms of my service in the Haganah, I'm gratified that I was able to make a contribution, and I'm also gratified that I survived the experience.
Fred, you showed a lot of photos of the Olim coming over on the Exodus and other boats. Did you have any chance to interact with any of them?
Oh yes, the boat I was on was packed. I think something like 7,000 DPs in a small freighter, and bunks 2 rows high, and toilets overhanging the edges of the ship, and the people camped out on the decks. And I had the gratification of forming some not necessarily friends, but acquaintances among the survivors who traveled on the ship. There were also a contingent of Europeans, former DPs, displaced persons, in my unit. And as I mentioned, we were a trilingual unit fortunately with several bilingual officers to take command. The trilingual is the Hebrew speakers, the English speakers, and as I mentioned, I was in a subunit manned mainly by South Africans, and the third was Yiddish-speaking survivors of the Holocaust. I had, again, some acquaintances there. I recall playing chess. I had a little portable chess set along with one of the Europeans, and he was a mighty fine chess player. And I did experience. We had one reunion on Joan and my first visit to when we went together to Israel. We had a formal reunion, and I had the pleasure of meeting many of the men that with whom I had fought and survived, both Sabras and European, and in my case, South African Jews.
Fred, they didn't lay out the welcome mat for you when you came to Israel. Can you tell us about what it was like getting on the boat and getting over there and getting in?
The boat itself was an experience. I compared in a general sense with the Jews wandering for 40 years, although it only took a couple of weeks in the deserts. And I also compare our fighting action with the Jews encountering the Canaanites, and we didn't have any of the super real miracles such as the falling of the walls of Jericho, but we consider the whole activity one grand miracle. That to have survived the invasion by 5 well-armed Arab states with a very meager kind of armaments. And
you weren't stopped getting off the boat when you landed in Israel?
Oh, we landed at night, and some lighters came from the shore, picked up all the men of military age, and secretly brought them ashore on the beaches of Israel. And
I noted the rough seas that you had going to Israel and going back to the States, and you're still a sailor?
I'm 92, so I'm not that active a sailor, but up through the 80s, Joan and I did a lot of sailing on the small sailboats in Marblehead and in the environs.
Well, thank you. If there are no other questions, it was wonderful.
Jacob
Yeah.
Samash has a question, Peter.
Who did?
I think Jacob Samash is where.
Oh, he's, oh, good.
Okay, I have a similar experience. I left Baghdad when I was 19 years old in 1947. So I am the same age as he is. Okay, and I went to Lebanon, waited for the boat for 2 days or 2 weeks, whatever, and we had the Marine Corps. It was a ship that carried troops hither and thither during the war. And I came on that ship. It took 2 weeks from the time we left Lebanon to the time we got to New York in 1947. I left Baghdad on July 9, and I arrived in New York on August 8, a month later, on the west side of New York on 34th Street. And of course, since then, he had a lot of work in engineering, and I devoted myself to helping people. So I went into medicine. And for 50 years, from 1949 to the end of 2000, I practiced medicine and I helped people. I took out cancers of the lung out, and I put pacemakers in, probably to the tune of about 1,500 pacemakers. I put the first pacemaker in Western Mass in 1962. So that's my story.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear that, and I admire your career. It's very inspiring.
Bob?
Thank you, thank you.
Fred, did you know any of the Newbridge engineers? You know, there are a lot of MIT graduates. Are you familiar with them?
I've only been here just shy of 6 months, and I'm very anxious to meet. Maybe you inspired me. Maybe we can organize an MIT reunion here.
You should.
Yes, sounds like a good idea.
Well, you just met one of them.
Well,
I guess I can show my, they call this ring here. Do I?
Your breasts,
This is
breast rat. Yeah, we have two
beaver
of them.
on a class ring, and it's generally referred to by the student body as the brass rat.
Do you have a red jacket?
I have a red jacket, yeah,
no.
gray flannel pants to go with it, and a red and silver tie.
I was the class speaker at our 50th reunion, and I'm ashamed to say that's the first time I bought a red jacket.
Well, thank you again, and Shabbat Shalom to everybody. And Michael Thorner will be back for the, I think, what, May, June, whatever month it's going to be.
Good job, Peter.
Well, I
Thank you.
suggested your
Thanks.
view of doing it by, I said earlier, Bob had suggested that we have a format where we have the speaker and someone engaging him in conversation, and then questions from the audience as we go along. So if you think that's a good idea, talk to Michael Thorner.
Thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you for being-
great.
Good job, Fred.
I look forward to meeting you in person.
Fred, I'm now a professor at the Harvard Business School, so I know what kind of work was involved in putting together that presentation. Kudos.
Yeah. Thank you very much.